the unassuming suburbs of Hendersonville, Tennessee, the Davis family home stood as a picture of quiet American life, masking a darkness that no neighbor could have predicted. On a stifling August night in 2012, this veneer of normalcy was obliterated when police discovered the body of Melanie Davis, found dead in a scene of unimaginable brutality. The perpetrator was not a wandering intruder, but her own flesh and blood, her 15-year-old son, Zachary Davis. As investigators peeled back the layers of this matricide, they found no history of abuse, no heated argument, and no sudden snap of passion. Instead, they uncovered a chilling indifference that defied psychological understanding. Zachary would calmly confess that killing his mother was merely a dress rehearsal, a cold-blooded experiment to desensitize himself for a larger, more gruesome plan involving his brother and neighbors. The courtroom would later be frozen in silence, not just by the physical violence, but by the teenager's clinical admission that he ended his mother's life simply for practice, a motive meticulously foreshadowed in the disturbed observations of a boy who had long since severed his tether to humanity. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. The winding stretches of asphalt that cut through Acton, Maine, are flanked by dense walls of white pine and oak, creating a natural barrier that separates the quiet, rural community from the noise of the outside world. In 2015, the town was the sort of place where privacy was a given, a collection of homes tucked away down long gravel driveways where neighbors waved in passing, but rarely encroached on one another's business. For Thomas and Sandra Smith, this isolation was a feature, not a bug. It was the ideal setting to raise a family grounded in traditional values, shielded from the moral decay they perceived in the broader culture. Their home on Man Road was intended to be a fortress of Christian devotion, a safe harbor for their son, Gavin. But by the autumn of that year, the silence surrounding the Smith household had curdled into something suffocating, concealing a domestic tragedy that was gestating in the bedroom of a quiet, bespectacled teenager. To the outside observer, the Smiths were the portrait of stability. Thomas Smith, 56, was a man of imposing physical stature but gentle demeanor, a figure who commanded respect yet offered warmth. He was known in the community for his work ethic and his deep, abiding faith. His wife, Sandra, 54, matched him in devotion. They were the kind of parents who were deeply involved, perhaps too involved, in the moral architecture of their child's life. They had adopted Gavin as an infant, a fact that was never treated as a division, but as a divine appointment. They loved him with a fierceness that bordered on desperation, wanting nothing more than for him to grow into a man of character. Gavin, however, was an enigma. At 15, going on 16, he was physically nondescript, slight of build, wearing wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a studious, harmless appearance. In the hallways of his local high school, he was a ghost. He was not the school bully, nor was he the primary victim of bullying. He simply existed in the periphery, the kind of student who could navigate an entire day without making a ripple in the social fabric. Teachers saw a quiet kid who did his work but offered nothing of himself. Peers saw a shadow, but this invisibility was a meticulously crafted armor. Behind the blank expression and the silence lay a mind that was rapidly decoupling from reality, a process that went largely unnoticed because it looked so much like the standard malaise of modern adolescence. The invisible signs of the coming violence were scattered throughout the mundane details of the Smith family's daily life, camouflaged by the assumption that teenage boys are naturally moody, withdrawn, and difficult. The first red flag was the retreat. Over the course of 2014 and 2015, Gavin had systematically withdrawn from the family unit. The shared meals and prayer times that Thomas and Sandra cherished became battlegrounds of passive aggression. Gavin would retreat to his room, a space that became less of a bedroom and more of a bunker. There, the influence of Thomas and Sandra ended, and the influence of the digital world began. In the solitude of that room, the teenager cultivated a secret life that stood in stark, violent contrast to the hymns and scripture readings his parents prioritized. While Thomas and Sandra worried about the secular influence of pop music or R-rated movies, Gavin was engaging with content that was far darker. He became fixated on the mechanics of death and the psychology of those who inflicted it. He spent hours absorbing the lore of past tragedies, specifically school shootings, not with a sense of horror, but with a clinical, almost academic fascination. He wasn't just watching, he was studying. This obsession was the first major fissure in the family dynamic. Yet it remained invisible because it occurred on screens that could be switched off the moment a bedroom door opened. The tension in the household was palpable, but it was misdiagnosed. Thomas and Sandra perceived a spiritual struggle. They saw a son drifting away from God and believed the remedy was tighter restriction and more enforced family time. They confiscated electronics, limited internet access, and insisted on church attendance. They believed they were fighting for his soul. They did not realize they were fighting for their lives. To Gavin, these restrictions were not acts of love, but acts of war. The removal of his iPod or the limiting of his video game time was not a disciplinary measure. It was the severance of his lifeline to the only world where he felt powerful. Journal entries and audio logs recovered later would reveal the depth of this resentment. In his private writings, the teenager did not express the hot, fiery rage of a temper tantrum. Instead, he documented a cold, creeping numbness. He wrote about the feeling of being trapped, not just by his parents' rules, but by the monotony of existence itself. He described a profound lack of empathy, a sensation that he was watching the world through a thick pane of glass. He questioned whether he was capable of feeling anything at all. This is where the concept of practice began to take root. It wasn't born out of a specific hatred for his parents, but rather a chilling utilitarianism. He wanted to know what it would feel like to cross the ultimate line. The practice narrative was the most disturbing element of his psychological profile. In the weeks leading up to the event, Gavin began to view his family not as human beings with whom he had a bond, but as NPCs, non-player characters in a video game, obstacles that needed to be cleared to unlock the next level. He fantasized about a larger event, a school shooting that would grant him the infamy he saw bestowed upon others in the media. But he doubted his own resolve. He needed a test run. He needed to verify that he had the capacity to kill. His parents, by virtue of their proximity and the vulnerability of their trust, became the unwitting subjects of this test. There were behavioral leaks, moments where the mask slipped, but they were dismissed as teenage angst. There was the time he was found with a knife he shouldn't have had, which his parents confiscated, viewing it as a boy's dangerous curiosity rather than a weapon of intent. There was the increasing monosyllabic nature of his responses, the deadness in his eyes when his father tried to engage him in conversation about his future. Thomas, a man who believed in the power of redemption, and patience, thought he just needed to wait out the storm of puberty. He didn't see that the storm was actually a vacuum, a void of emotion that was consuming his son from the inside out. The school environment offered no better safety net. In the crowded corridors, Gavin's lack of connection was an asset to his anonymity. Teachers noted he was quiet or reserved, adjectives that appear on the report cards of countless students who never hurt a fly. There were no outbursts in class, no fights in the cafeteria. He was compliant. This compliance was the most dangerous camouflage of all. It suggested a baseline of normalcy that reassured the adults around him. If he had been acting out, throwing chairs or screaming, intervention might have occurred. But silence is rarely treated as an emergency. One specific point of contention became the catalyst for the final acceleration toward violence, the restriction of his digital access. When Thomas and Sandra took away his phone and computer privileges as punishment for grades or attitude, they inadvertently stripped away his coping mechanism. Left alone with his own thoughts and without the distraction of the screen, Gavin's dark ideations festered. He began to pace his room, plotting. He wasn't brooding over the unfairness of the punishment. He was calculating the logistics of the removal of the punishers. The family dynamic in the Smith house was a tragedy of misalignment. You had two parents operating in a framework of love, discipline, and religious salvation, trying to pull their son back toward the light. Opposite them stood a son operating in a framework of nihilism, desensitization, and violent fantasy, plotting to extinguish that light to see if it would make him feel something. The parents were playing a game of tug-of-war, unaware that the rope had already snapped. The physical setting of the house on Man Road amplified this danger. It was a home designed for privacy, set back from the road, surrounded by woods. If something were to happen there, no neighbor would hear a scream. No passerby would see a struggle. The isolation that Thomas and Sandra prized for its peace was exactly what Gavin required for his practice. He knew that once the act was initiated, there would be no interference. The geography of the home emboldened him. In the days prior to the incident, the atmosphere in the house was brittle. Gavin went through the motions of family life, eating dinner, doing chores, while internally rehearsing the mechanics of murder. He thought about weapons. He thought about timing. He thought about the layout of the house. He looked at his father, a man physically superior to him, and calculated the element of surprise. He looked at his mother and weighed her emotional devastation against his need for desensitization. These were not the impulsive thoughts of a child acting in heat of passion. They were the cold, clinically precise calculations of a predator, assessing prey. The tragedy of the background story lies in the ordinary nature of the red flags. Every parent of a teenager has dealt with a child who slams doors, refuses to talk, or spends too much time online. Every parent has worried about the influence of violent media. The signs were visible, but they were unreadable because the cipher necessary to decode them, the knowledge of Gavin's internal monologue, was hidden in digital caches and the silent recesses of his mind. The community of Acton saw a good Christian family working through a rough patch. The school saw a quiet student. Thomas and Sandra saw a beloved son who was lost. Only Gavin saw the reality that the house was no longer a home, but a training ground. As November deepened and the Maine woods turned grey and cold, the threshold was approached. The journals and audio logs from this period reflect a chilling sense of inevitability. He wrote as if the murders were a task on a checklist, something unpleasant, but necessary to achieve a higher goal. There was no hatred in the traditional sense, no burning vendetta. There was only the terrifying void of the practice logic. He had convinced himself that to become the person he wanted to be, a figure of fear and power, he first had to dismantle the people who loved him. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the invisible signs were about to become horrifyingly visible. The timeline of the tragedy that unfolded in Hendersonville, Tennessee, on the night of August 10, 2012, is a reconstruction of silence shattered by frantic desperation. It begins not with a noise, but with the quiet, suffocating humidity of a late summer evening on Aileen Court. The suburban silence disguised the movements of 15-year-old Zachary Davis inside the single-story residence he shared with his mother, Melanie Davis, and his older brother, Josh. At 11:11 p.m., the house was dark. Melanie Davis had retired to her bedroom for the night, seeking rest after a week of work. In the adjacent room, Josh Davis was asleep. The layout of the home would become a critical component of the police investigation, highlighting the proximity of the family members to one another and the chilling stealth required to navigate the hallway without raising an alarm. According to forensic reconstructions and later confessions, Zachary did not sleep. He spent the hour leading up to midnight pacing in his room, surrounded by the notebook that would later become a centerpiece of the prosecution's case, a journal filled with dark, nihilistic scrawlings and crude illustrations of violence. At approximately 11:20 p.m., Zachary exited his bedroom. He was not empty-handed. He had procured a sledgehammer from the family's garage, a heavy, blunt instrument that required two hands to wield effectively. He also carried a knife, a secondary weapon intended to ensure lethality. The sheer weight of the sledgehammer contrasted with the boy's slight frame, yet he moved with a predetermined purpose toward his mother's door. The attack commenced minutes later. The forensic pathology report indicates that Melanie Davis was struck while she slept. There were no defensive wounds initially, suggesting she never had the opportunity to wake or process the betrayal occurring in the dark. The first blow was catastrophic. The clinical nature of the crime scene analysis later described a pattern of strikes that went beyond incapacitation. They were methodical, delivered with a force that belied the attacker's age. This was the moment Zachary would later describe to detectives with a terrifying lack of emotion, the act he referred to as his practice run. The silence of the house was broken only by the dull thuds of impact, sounds that were dampened by the walls, but eventually loud enough to disturb the sleep of the second intended victim. In the next room, Josh Davis woke to a disturbance. It was not a scream, but a series of heavy, rhythmic noises coming from his mother's room. Confused and groggy, Josh sat up in bed. The time was approximately 11:25 p.m. Before he could call out to his mother, his bedroom door opened. The hallway light backlit a figure holding a large object. Zachary entered his brother's room. The transition from the attack on Melanie to the assault on Josh marked a shift from a stealth execution to a chaotic struggle. Zachary swung the sledgehammer at his brother. The blow connected with Josh's head, a glancing but severe strike that opened a laceration and sent him reeling back onto the mattress. Unlike his mother, Josh was awake and adrenaline surged instantly. He raised his arms to deflect the second swing, the heavy iron head of the hammer grazing his body. The transcript of the subsequent police interview with Josh reveals the confusion of those seconds. He recalled shouting at his brother, asking what he was doing, pleading for him to stop. Zachary did not speak. He abandoned the heavy hammer, which was difficult to swing in the confined space of the bedroom, and the struggle became hand-to-hand. Zachary attempted to use the knife, slashing at his brother. Josh, older and physically larger, managed to kick Zachary away, scrambling out of the bed and forcing his way past the attacker toward the door. At 11:28 p.m., the dynamic of the crime scene expanded beyond the walls of the Davis home. Josh Davis, bleeding profusely from the head wound and suffering from shock, fled the house. He ran barefoot across the driveway and the asphalt of Aileen Court, heading toward a neighbor's residence. He pounded on the door, leaving smears of blood on the frame, screaming for help. Inside the Davis home, the violence had ceased, but the destruction had not. Zachary, realizing his brother had escaped and the police would be imminent, initiated the final phase of his plan. He did not chase Josh. Instead, he returned to the interior of the house. He retrieved a bottle of accelerant. He moved to the master bedroom where his mother lay deceased and doused the room. He then poured the flammable liquid throughout the hallway and the living room. With a flick of a lighter, the house on Aileen Court began to burn. The fire spread rapidly, fed by the accelerant and the dry summer air, the orange glow beginning to flicker against the windows. The first call to emergency services was logged at 11:31 p.m. The caller was the neighbor, whose voice on the 911 tape is high-pitched and breathless. The operator asks for the location, and the neighbor struggles to articulate the address while relaying that a boy is at their door, covered in blood, claiming his brother tried to kill him. In the background of the call, Josh's voice can be heard, faint and panicked, saying, "He killed her. I think he killed her." Dispatch immediately alerted the Hendersonville Police Department and the fire department. The radio traffic from that night captures the escalation. The initial code went out as a domestic disturbance with injuries, quickly upgraded to an active assault with a weapon. Within 60 seconds of the dispatch, a patrol unit in the vicinity acknowledged the call and turned toward Aileen Court. At 11:36 p.m., the first police cruiser arrived on the scene. The body cam footage from the responding officer provides a grainy, chaotic view of the street. The neighbor's porch light illuminates Josh Davis, who is sitting on the steps, holding a towel to his head. The officer approaches with his weapon drawn, scanning the darkness for the assailant. The air is already thick with the smell of smoke. "Where is he?" the officer asks. Josh points toward his own house across the street. "He's in there. He has a hammer." As the officer turns toward the Davis residence, flames are visible, licking up the curtains of the front window. The fire had taken hold. The priority shifted instantly from a tactical entry to a perimeter containment and fire response. Officers could not enter the burning structure to check for Melanie Davis without fire support. They set up a perimeter, weapons trained on the exits, expecting an armed suspect to emerge. They did not have to wait long. At 11:39 p.m., Zachary Davis walked out of the back of the house. He was not running. He was not holding the weapon. He walked calmly into the backyard, illuminated by the flashlights of officers who had circled around the rear. The body cam audio captures the commands, "Get on the ground, show me your hands." Zachary complied slowly. He lowered himself to the grass, his demeanor eerily detached. He was wearing clothes that were spattered with blood, yet he appeared uninjured. As officers moved in to cuff him, one officer noted in his supplemental report that the teenager was not breathing heavily, nor was he crying. He was silent. When asked if anyone else was inside, Zachary looked at the burning house and simply nodded. By 11:45 p.m., the Hendersonville Fire Department was on the scene, deploying hoses to battle the blaze that now engulfed the master bedroom. The medical response team arrived simultaneously to attend to Josh. The paramedics worked quickly to stabilize him. His vitals were erratic, his heart rate spiking from blood loss and acute stress. They bandaged the head wound, noting the depression in the skull consistent with blunt force trauma, and loaded him into the ambulance for transport to Vanderbilt University Medical Center. While the firefighters battled the flames, a crime scene log was established. Detective personnel began arriving at 11:55 p.m. The fire was brought under control within 20 minutes, but the damage to the interior was severe. The water used to extinguish the fire had mixed with the blood and soot, creating a grim slurry on the floors of the home. At 12:15 a.m. on August 11th, fire personnel cleared the structure enough for a preliminary search. They located the body of Melanie Davis in the master bedroom. She was found on the bed, her body partially damaged by the fire, but the nature of her injuries was immediately apparent to the first responders. This was a crime scene of extreme brutality. The medical examiner's field notes from later that morning would confirm that she had died prior to the fire starting, sparing her the agony of the flames, but confirming the immediate lethality of the attack. Back at the patrol cars, Zachary Davis was placed in the back of a cruiser. The in-car camera system recorded him sitting in the hard plastic seat. He did not bang on the windows or scream. He watched the activity outside, the flashing lights, the hoses, the frantic movements of the first responders, with a gaze that officers would later describe as curious. At one point, an officer opened the door to check on him. Zachary asked for water. He did not ask about his mother. He did not ask about his brother. At 1 a.m., the investigation transitioned from the immediate response to forensic processing. The area around the house was taped off. Technicians began the process of photographing the exterior, marking the blood trail Josh had left on the driveway. Inside the cruiser, Zachary was read his Miranda rights. He indicated he understood. When the transport officer prepared to drive him to the station for interrogation, Zachary made a comment that would be entered into the record and later read aloud in court. He expressed concern about his notebook. He wanted to know if the fire had destroyed his room. The notebook, found later by arson investigators, protected partially by its position under other debris, contained the blueprint of the mindset that led to the night's events. But in the immediate aftermath, as the ambulance carried the surviving victim away and the coroner's van arrived for the deceased, the focus was on the 15-year-old boy in the backseat of the police car. The drive to the station was short. Upon arrival, Zachary was placed in an interview room. It was here, in the early hours of the morning, that the practice motive would be verbalized. But on the scene at Aileen Court, the reality was physical and immediate. The police recovered the sledgehammer near the back door where Zachary had dropped it. It was charred and stained. They found the knife in the hallway. The reconstruction of the timeline reveals a window of violence that lasted less than 10 minutes, from the moment Zachary picked up the hammer to the moment Josh fled the house. In those 10 minutes, a family was dismantled. The 911 calls serve as the audio anchor of the night, shifting from the neighbor's terror to the dispatcher's controlled urgency. The body cam footage serves as the visual witness, capturing the transition from a quiet suburban street to a theater of fire and blood. As dawn broke over Hendersonville on August 11th, the house was a smoking ruin. The neighbors stood behind the police tape, watching the investigators carry out bags of evidence. The medical updates on Josh indicated he would survive, though the psychological scars would be permanent. The autopsy of Melanie Davis began. cataloguing the injuries that Zachary had inflicted. And in a small interrogation room, a 15-year-old boy sat with a bottle of water, ready to explain that the devastation of the previous night was merely a test of his own capacity for murder. The night of the attack was over, but the shock of the details, the journal, the practice, the fire, was just beginning to ripple outward from the epicenter on Aileen Court. The air inside the Wake County Justice Center in Raleigh, North Carolina, was heavy with a silence that felt less like tranquility and more like the holding of breath. It was July of 2017, and the courtroom was packed. In the defendant's chair sat Gavin Smith, now 18 years old, but looking much younger, his frame slight and his expression difficult to read. He had been 15 when the crime occurred, a fact that hung over the proceedings like a thick fog. This was the sentencing hearing, the final chapter in a legal process that had begun with a 911 call 3 years prior. The question before Judge Paul Ridgway was not one of guilt. Gavin had already pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill, but of duration. How long does a society lock away a child who kills for no apparent reason? The answer, the prosecution argued, lay within a composition notebook found in the boy's bedroom, a document that would become the centerpiece of the day's proceedings. Assistant District Attorney Boz Zellinger stood to address the court, holding the physical evidence that would dismantle the defense's narrative of a snapped, confused teenager. The defense had tried to paint a picture of a boy lost in a haze of adolescence and potential mental instability, but Zellinger held the counter-argument in his hands. It was a standard black and white speckled notebook, the kind used by millions of high school students for biology notes or history homework. But the handwriting inside detailed a curriculum of calculated violence. The courtroom grew deathly still as Zellinger prepared to read the entries aloud. This was the moment the media had been waiting for, the revelation of the practice motive that had been whispered about since the initial arrest. Zellinger opened the notebook. His voice was steady, projecting the clinical horror of the words written by a 15-year-old hand. The entry was dated prior to the weekend of the attack. Gavin had written about his urge to kill, not out of rage or abuse, but out of curiosity and a cold, strategic necessity. The prosecutor read the passage where Gavin described his family not as loved ones, but as obstacles and test subjects. He wrote that he needed to kill them to see if he could go through with it. The word practice hung in the air, vibrating with a chilling resonance. The entry detailed that eliminating his parents was a prerequisite step, a training exercise to prepare him for a future career as a serial killer. He wanted to know what it felt like to end a life, to test his own emotional threshold, and to ensure he had the stomach for the violence he planned to inflict on strangers later in life. As Zellinger read, the disconnect between the mundane setting of a teenager's journal and the atrocity of the content was palpable. The prosecutor highlighted the methodical nature of the writing. There were no frantic scribbles of a psychotic break. The handwriting was legible, the thoughts organized. Gavin had planned to kill his father, Michael Smith, first, because he viewed him as the larger physical threat. The journal outlined the logistics, the retrieval of the firearm, the timing, the positioning. It was a tactical manual drafted by a child against his own protectors. Zellinger emphasized that this was not a crime of passion, but a crime of experimentation. Michael Smith was not killed because of a grievance. He was killed because he was available. The description of the event, as corroborated by the journal and the crime scene analysis, was recounted for the record. On that weekend in 2015, Gavin had taken a gun and shot his father. When his mother, Susan Smith, rushed in to see what had happened, he turned the weapon on her. The bullet struck her, but miraculously, she survived. The prosecutor paused, allowing the gravity of the practice claim to settle. The state's argument was clear. A mind that conceptualizes parricide as a warm-up exercise is a mind that poses a permanent danger to the public. The journal entries were not fantasies. They were blueprints that had been executed with terrifying precision. Following the prosecution's presentation of the journal, the court turned its attention to the psychological evaluations. This was the battleground where the defense hoped to salvage some future for Gavin. Dr. George Corvin, a psychiatrist, took the stand to offer insight into the caverns of the boy's mind. The defense's narrative hinged on the underdeveloped teenage brain and the presence of severe emotional detachment. The court listened as the clinical terms were laid out: depersonalization, derealization, and a profound lack of empathy that might not be permanent given his age. The defense argued that the journal entries, while horrific, were the product of an immature brain unable to grasp the finality of death. They painted Gavin as a boy who had retreated so far into a world of violent ideation that he lost touch with the reality of moral consequences. Dr. Corvin suggested that Gavin was not a born monster, but a hollow vessel, a child who felt empty and sought to fill that void with the adrenaline and significance of a violent act. The defense attorney, trying to humanize the defendant, pointed out that Gavin had no prior history of violence, no record of delinquency. He was, by all external accounts, a polite, quiet boy until the moment he wasn't. They argued that the practice entry was a form of role-playing that went too far, a disastrous collision of fantasy and reality. However, the prosecution countered with their own psychological interpretation, using the same evaluations to draw a different conclusion. They pointed to the lack of remorse immediately following the act. When police had arrived at the scene, Gavin hadn't been weeping over his father's body. He had been calm. The psychological reports indicated a chilling level of rationality. He knew what he was doing was illegal, and he knew it was wrong by societal standards, but he simply didn't care. The prosecutor argued that the practice motive demonstrated a level of premeditation that defied the confused child defense. You do not practice an accident. You do not rehearse a snap decision. The emotional apex of the hearing arrived when the victim who survived, Gavin's mother, Susan Smith, addressed the court. In cases of patricide and attempted matricide, the surviving parent often stands as the most tragic figure, torn between the loss of a spouse and the love for a child. Susan Smith's presence in the courtroom was commanding. She bore the physical scars of the attack and the invisible, crushing weight of her husband's death. Yet, when she spoke, her words were not of vengeance, but of a complex, heartbreaking plea for mercy and help. Susan stood before Judge Ridgway, her voice trembling but resolute. She acknowledged the horror of what her son had done. She did not deny the journal entries or the practice motive. She lived with the reality that her son had shot her. But she told the court that she had forgiven him. She spoke of the boy she raised, the son she knew before the darkness took hold. She argued that locking him away and throwing away the key would be a compounding tragedy. She implored the judge to consider that Gavin was sick, that the mind which wrote those entries was a diseased mind in need of treatment, not a cage. She expressed a terrifying hope that the boy who killed for practice could be unmade, and that the human being underneath could be salvaged. It was a moment that stunned the courtroom. A victim begging for the life of her attacker, who happened to be her own flesh and blood. The conflicting narratives left Judge Ridgway with an unenviable task. He had to balance the cold, hard text of the journal, evidence of a budding predator, against the pleas of the mother and the scientific reality of juvenile brain development. The law required justice for Michael Smith, whose life was extinguished as a mere test run. It required protection for society against a person who viewed murder as a skill to be honed, but it also had to account for the defendant's youth. Judge Ridgway began his sentencing remarks by acknowledging the chilling nature of the evidence. He cited the journal specifically, noting that the practice entry indicated a degree of calculation that was rare even in adult offenders. He spoke about the terror Michael Smith must have felt and the betrayal inherent in being killed by one's own child in one's own home. The judge rejected the notion that this was a spur-of-the-moment tragedy. The journal proved otherwise. It proved intent. It proved that Gavin had looked at his family and seen targets. However, the judge also addressed the mother's plea. He acknowledged Susan Smith's extraordinary capacity for forgiveness, calling it a testament to her character. But the role of the court, he explained, was distinct from the role of a parent. A parent can forgive. The law must punish. The judge noted that while Gavin was a minor at the time of the crime, the severity of the act and the reasoning behind it, the practice motive, required a sentence that ensured the public was safe for a very long time. The courtroom stood as Judge Ridgway delivered the final decision. He sentenced Gavin Smith to a maximum of 50 years in prison. The sentence was structured to ensure that Gavin would spend the majority of his adult life behind bars. Specifically, for the second-degree murder of his father, he received a sentence of roughly 30 years. For the assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill regarding his mother, the judge added a consecutive sentence, stacking the time rather than allowing it to be served simultaneously. This ensured that Gavin would not be eligible for release until he was a middle-aged man, far removed from the 15-year-old who wrote about killing for practice. The sentence was a compromise, but a harsh one. It was not the life without parole that the state might have sought for an adult, but it was far more than the treatment-focused confinement the defense had hoped for. It was a recognition that while the brain of a 15-year-old is unfinished, the actions of this specific 15-year-old were too dangerous to risk early release. As the deputies moved to handcuff Gavin and lead him out of the courtroom, the finality of the journal's impact was clear. The words he had written in the privacy of his bedroom had sealed his fate. He had wanted to know what it felt like to kill, to see if he could do it. The court had answered with what it felt like to face the consequences. The practice was over. The reality of decades in prison had just begun. The aftermath of the sentencing left the courtroom in a state of somber reflection. Susan Smith watched her son be taken away, a scene that marked the end of the legal battle, but the continuation of a life defined by loss. The prosecutors packed up the evidence, the speckled notebook slipping back into a manila envelope, its contents now a matter of public record and legal precedent. The psychological reports were filed away. The debate about the nature of evil in children paused until the next tragedy. In the corridors of the courthouse, reporters spoke in hushed tones, dictating the headline that would run across the state. The teenager who stabbed at the fabric of his family, shooting them to test his nerve, was gone. The narrative of the practice killing had shocked the community because it violated the fundamental assumption of family life, that the home is a sanctuary and children are innocent. Gavin Smith's journal had shattered that illusion, proving that sometimes the monster is not hiding under the bed, but sleeping in it, waiting for the right moment to train. The sentence handed down by Judge Ridgway was a closing of the door, a legal quarantine of a mindset that viewed murder as a methodology. For the residents of Wake County, the trial was over, but the chilling question posed by the prosecutor's reading of the journal remained. If that was just practice, what would the main event have looked like? The smoke has long since cleared from the quiet residential street in Hendersonville, Tennessee, but the psychological haze remaining over the community is as thick and suffocating as the night Melanie Davis was bludgeoned to death. When the frantic lights of emergency vehicles faded, leaving the charred shell of a suburban home, the true devastation was only just beginning to manifest. For the survivors, the legal system, and the neighbors who once waved hello to a quiet 15-year-old boy, the legacy of Zachary Davis's crime is a fracture that time has refused to heal. At the center of this shattered reality stands Josh Davis, the older brother who woke up not to the sound of family breakfast, but to the smell of gasoline and the realization that his own flesh and blood intended for him to burn. The betrayal inherent in familial homicide is absolute, but in the Davis case, it is compounded by the terrifying randomness of the survivor's existence. Josh was not spared out of mercy. He was spared by the physics of a failed arson attempt. The psychological burden of being the leftover family member in a plan designed to erase the entire lineage is a heavy mantle. In the years following the trial, the narrative of the surviving brother has become one of quiet endurance. While the court system processes evidence and psychiatrists debate diagnoses, the survivor is left to reconcile the memories of a brother he thought he knew with the monster who wielded a sledgehammer. The trust that forms the bedrock of a family unit, the assumption of safety within one's own home, was obliterated, leaving a void that extends beyond the Davis property line and into the collective psyche of Sumner County. The community of Hendersonville, typically insulated from the macabre details of violent crime, found itself forced to confront a terrifying question. How does a monster hide in plain sight? Neighbors recalled Zachary as odd, perhaps a bit withdrawn, but certainly not a harbinger of such visceral violence. The shattering of this suburban illusion is the crime's wider legacy. It stripped the neighborhood of its innocence, replacing the comfort of familiarity with a lingering paranoia. Every withdrawn teenager, every quiet dispute became a source of potential alarm. The realization that the boy next door was documenting his descent into homicidal fantasy in a notebook just yards away from where children played fundamentally altered the community's sense of security. The practice run, as Davis so chillingly described it, was not just an attack on his mother. It was an assault on the social contract of the town itself. The courtroom proceedings that followed the arrest did more than just establish guilt. They opened a window into the abyss of juvenile psychopathy that experts are still struggling to close. The journal entries, which shocked the courtroom with their banality as much as their brutality, served as the roadmap of a mind devoid of empathy. These were not the frantic scribblings of a psychotic break, but the calculated blueprints of a predator in training. Dr. William Burnett and other forensic experts who analyzed Davis were tasked with dissecting a psyche that defied the standard rehabilitative optimism usually afforded to minors. The practice element of his confession, stating that killing his mother was a necessary step to steel himself for future serial killings, presented a clinical profile of callous unemotional traits that is rarely seen in such a crystallized form in a 15-year-old. The legacy of the Davis case in the realm of forensic psychiatry is the terrifying clarity of his detachment. During the trial, when the audio of his confession was played, the courtroom listened in stunned silence as a soft-spoken teenager described the mechanics of bludgeoning his mother with the same emotional resonance one might use to describe taking out the trash. He admitted to laughing as she died. This specific detail, the laughter, became the fulcrum upon which the expert testimony turned. It suggested a profound deficit in the neural circuitry that processes shared human suffering. For the mental health professionals involved, Davis became a case study in the limits of intervention. If a 15-year-old views matricide merely as a logistical hurdle to a career in serial murder, is rehabilitation even a theoretical possibility? The experts battled over the labels schizotypal personality disorder, autism spectrum disorder, psychopathy. But the legacy left behind is the unsettling realization that some fissures in the human mind may be too deep to bridge. This psychiatric conundrum bled directly into the legal precedents set by the case. The trial of Zachary Davis occurred against the backdrop of a shifting national landscape regarding juvenile justice. With the Supreme Court of the United States ruling in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional, the Davis case became a testing ground for how the justice system navigates the worst of the worst among minor offenders. The prosecution argued that the level of premeditation, evidenced by the notebook and the purchase of the sledgehammer, combined with the absolute lack of remorse, necessitated a sentence that would permanently remove Davis from society. The presiding judge, Judge D. Gay, was faced with the heavy task of balancing the biological reality of an underdeveloped adolescent brain against the absolute moral void exhibited by the defendant. The sentencing hearing was a grim affair, devoid of the usual tearful pleas for forgiveness from the accused. Davis sat stone-faced, occasionally smirking, a demeanor that likely sealed his fate more effectively than any prosecutorial argument. The resulting life sentence was a declaration by the state of Tennessee that public safety superseded the theoretical potential for juvenile redemption in cases of such extreme depravity. This decision has since been cited in legal circles as a benchmark for discretionary sentencing. It reinforced the notion that while age is a mitigating factor, it is not an absolute shield when the crime exhibits the hallmarks of adult-level calculation and cruelty. However, the legal legacy is not static. The ripples of the Davis verdict continue to interact with evolving state laws. The tension between the Miller ruling and state-level implementation means that cases like Davis's are never truly closed. They hover in a state of appellate purgatory, constantly re-examined under new jurisprudential lights. For the surviving family and the community, this legal flux prevents total closure. There is always the spectre of a retrial, a resentencing, or a technicality that could dredge the trauma back to the surface. The shattered trust is rebroken with every appeal notification, reminding Josh Davis and the wider community that the nightmare has an indefinite shelf life. The physical site of the murder has changed, but the energetic footprint remains. In many cases of familial homicide, the home is razed, a desperate attempt to scrub the geography of its history. Whether the structure stands or falls, the location becomes a scar on the map. In Hendersonville, the memory of the fire and the sledgehammer serves as a grim cautionary tale about the unknowability of those we live with. Parents in the community became more vigilant, perhaps overly so, monitoring journals and internet search histories with a new fearful intensity. The Davis case forced a loss of innocence regarding the sanctity of childhood. It proved that a child could harbor the darkness of a seasoned killer, hiding it behind a veil of teenage angst until the moment the hammer fell. The journal entries themselves remain the most haunting artifact of the case's legacy. They stripped away the defense of snapping or sudden passion. They revealed a long, slow, gestating hatred that was meticulously nurtured. For the legal system, these writings provided a rare and terrifying glimpse into the formation of intent. They are now studied not just as evidence of guilt, but as a lexicon of warning signs. Educators, school counselors, and law enforcement officers in Tennessee and beyond have used the Davis case as a reference point for threat assessment. The practice rhetoric used by Davis has alerted professionals to the danger of instrumental violence, violence used as a tool for learning or emotional testing, rather than just reactive violence. This shift in understanding is a crucial, albeit tragic, legacy of the tragedy. It has refined the lens through which threats from minors are evaluated, moving the focus from immediate anger to cold, detached planning. Ultimately, the legacy of the Zachary Davis case is defined by the silence of the aftermath. It is the silence of a mother who will never speak again, the silence of a brother who lives with the noise of memory, and the silence of a cell where a young man sits, presumably still devoid of the remorse that society so desperately wants to see. The practice run became the final act, a devastating paradox where a rehearsal for a life of crime ended two lives, Melanie's physically and Zachary's legally. The shattering of trust is total. There is no glue strong enough to repair the bond when a child looks at a parent and sees not a caregiver, but a training dummy. That is the chilling, enduring frequency that the Davis case continues to broadcast. The terrifying possibility that for some, the most sacred human connections are nothing more than obstacles to a darker ambition. The devastation also forced a re-evaluation of the support systems available for surviving siblings in cases of parricide. Josh Davis found himself in a unique and lonely demographic, a victim of his brother, yet carrying the same name, the same blood. The societal stigma attached to the family name is a heavy burden for the innocent survivor. The community's attempt to heal often involves pushing away the reminder of the tragedy, which inadvertently isolates the survivor further. The legacy here is a failing of social infrastructure. We have robust systems for punishing the guilty, but fragile, ill-defined pathways for supporting the family members who are left standing in the ashes. As the years pass, the shock value of the headlines fades, but the case law solidifies. Zachary Davis's name appears in legal briefs and psychiatric journals, a data point in the study of evil. But for the people of Hendersonville, he remains a ghost story that is entirely too real. The journal entries, once shocking to a courtroom, have become a permanent stain on the collective memory, a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones under the bed, but the ones sitting at the dinner table, quietly taking notes. The trust was not just shattered, it was pulverized, leaving a dust that coats every memory of the Davis family, a grim testament to the night a 15-year-old boy decided to practice being a killer and succeeded all too well. The evidence locker in Wake County holds many artifacts of violence, but few possess the chilling gravity of Gavin Smith's journal. In those pages, the 15-year-old did not document teenage angst or familial grievances, but rather the cold logistics of a tactical exercise. The terrifying reality of this case lies in the specific rationale provided by the perpetrator. Gavin did not strike out of blinding rage or in response to abuse, but for practice, treating the lives of Acton, Katrina, and Christopher Smith as expendable variables in a twisted preparation for a fantasy career in the SAS. This utilitarian view of murder strips the act of any emotional context, leaving only a hollow, mechanical brutality that horrified the jury and the public alike. The survival of Katrina and Christopher serves as a testament to physical resilience, yet it underscores the permanent absence of Acton Smith, a father murdered in the supposed sanctuary of his own bedroom. The breach of trust here is absolute. Parents are biologically wired to protect their offspring, but there is no evolutionary preparation for a child who methodically hunts their protectors. The prosecution proved that this was a premeditated ambush, a betrayal that shattered the foundational contract of the family unit. Ultimately, the life sentence of Gavin Smith offers a legal resolution, but fails to satisfy the deeper, unsettling inquiries regarding the origins of such malice. Whether this detachment was born from a hidden neurological anomaly or nurtured by an unchecked obsession with militaristic violence, the result remains the same. A quiet North Carolina home was turned into a killing field by the very life it nurtured. We are left with a haunting image of a boy who sought to harden himself for war, only to wage it against the only people who truly loved him, extinguishing his potential alongside his father's life.